policy exchange conversation about the future of industrial policy. And we're very pleased to welcome Sarah Jones, who's the Shadow Minister for Industry and Decarbonisation. Has been the MP for Croydon Central since 2017, and before that she'd had a range of public sector and private sector jobs. She was part of the team that prepared for the 2012 London Olympics and has also worked senior jobs in the National Health Service. My name is Geoffrey Owen. I work on industrial policy in Policy Exchange here. So the procedure is as follows. I will just make a few opening remarks, not very long, about the issues that we're going to talk about. I will then ask Sarah to talk to us for some 15 minutes or so. Then we will have a little bit of a conversation between ourselves before we open up to questions from the floor and from the online audience. And then we will aim to finish not later than 12 noon. So just a sentence or two by way of setting the scene. As everybody is well aware, the pros and cons of industrial policy in the sense of targeted intervention by governments to support particular industries has become a big global political issue, partly because of the policy changes that have taken place in the United States and followed in some ways by the European Union. President Biden has launched a whole series of programs which are relatively new for the American experience, intervening to preserve or expand industries such as semiconductors or batteries for electric cars, which for one reason or another are thought to be essential for the national interest. Several motivations have prompted this change: worries about supply chains in certain areas, over-dependence on China, the need to accelerate decarbonisation, and other factors. And the EU has been following similar track with a strong emphasis on strategic autonomy in particular sectors. And the issue which has been much discussed, is still much discussed, is how should the UK respond to all that? As you know, we had an explicit industrial policy in the UK under the coalition government in 2010 to 2015. That policy or that approach was taken much further by Theresa May and Greg Clark in 2017. And much of the program that they set up, they started in that program, is still in place. But the attitude of the subsequent Conservative governments has been unclear. And although there has been intervention in a number of areas, like in batteries and in the steel industry with Port Talbot and so on, there seems to be a little bit of reluctance to use the phrase industrial strategy for some reason. And so there is a certain lack of clarity and lack of consistency which have been the source of complaint. So in this situation, therefore, it's particularly interesting to think about and hear about how any future Labour government might approach industrial policy. In what way might it be different from what we've had in the last decade or so? So that's why we're particularly pleased that Sarah is joining us today, and I'll ask her to say a few words.
Thank you. Can I start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here at Policy Exchange today. We meet in turbulent times, of course, a Prime Minister trying to stop his troops from toppling him again, an economy stuttering along after years of shocks and stagnation and managed decline, and a country increasingly disconnected from their political class as problems are perceived as being unaddressed. But we also meet in a year where change, of course, is coming. There will be a general election, and the choice at that general election will be 5 more years of the same, or a change under a new Labour Party. Changed to its very core, I would say, to the party looking to the country once again and asking how it can serve. So today I want us to think a bit about the case for industrial strategy, where this government, I believe, has got it wrong, the opportunity that net zero brings, and how Labour is developing our thinking. So at the heart of our renewed agenda is our commitment to industrial policy and industrial strategy. These are topics that have gone in and out of fashion over the years, but are well and truly back in the limelight at the moment, as Sir Geoffrey said. I've been looking forward to this conversation with Sir Geoffrey, given his belief that, as I quote, the history of state intervention is a disappointing one. I'm confident that we can have an interesting and thoughtful discussion. The discussion when it comes to industrial policy is often framed as a philosophical one or an ideological one, a binary discussion between picking winners on the one hand versus letting the market decide on the other. But I think we need to move beyond that crude dichotomy. Rachel Reeves, our Shadow Chancellor, will today give the prestigious Mays Lecture, making the case that Britain faces a 1979 moment, vowing that a Labour government would work with businesses to create a decade of renewal. But that unlike the 1980s, growth in the years to come must be broad-based, inclusive and resilient, and that a changing world means a change in the way we run our economy. So today, within that context, I want us to have a discussion about what the role of a modern industrial strategy might be. Because for Labour, industrial strategy is not particularly philosophical or ideological. It's a practical response to the challenges ahead. The best way to deliver growth across the whole country so people are better off and our country is more secure. We don't accept that Britain's infrastructure should be crumbling, that our energy bills should be sky high, that rates of business investment should be so low. We can aspire to growth, rising living standards and clean power. But we need an industrial strategy, that long-term plan, that leadership, that vision to get us there. Now, net zero is a huge opportunity. The world we face in the decades ahead is far less certain than the one behind us, and the challenges we face are complex and interconnected. We have the crisis of economic stagnation and the political crisis that has led to, of instability, of populism drawing in from the margins. We have geopolitical challenges, war in Europe, war in the Middle East, the rise of China that must be grappled with. And of course, the challenge of climate change and decarbonisation that will reshape our economy from top to bottom. So net zero is a huge challenge. And as Johnny Reynolds always says, decarbonisation must never mean deindustrialisation. But it's also the biggest opportunity that the UK has right now to deliver good jobs, clean homegrown power and economic growth once more. Setting the right policy environment is a necessary condition to enable that shift, and that's where the industrial strategy comes in. We need to speed up and scale up key technologies like green hydrogen and offshore wind, boost industries like automotive, aviation and green steel. We're in a race for these industries and the jobs that come with them, and the US and the EU have already moved. We can't pretend that the programmes being put forward by our allies and our competitors aren't happening. The reality is that businesses I meet say to me, why would we invest in the UK when we could go to America or the EU, where there are less barriers and a more attractive investment proposition? If Britain doesn't respond, we will simply be left behind. So how do we design an industrial strategy? Rachel Reeves was right last year when she told leaders in Washington that we cannot rely on a handful of industries for our economic success, nor can we outsource the supply of critical goods and services to the lowest bidder. Keir Starmer was right in December when he told the Resolution Foundation that in this global economy, it is negligent not to take a view on which sectors can compete, and even more negligent not to use the power of government to back them properly. And Johnny Reynolds was right when he launched our industrial strategy to set out its core principles of partnership, of state and market, business and worker, hand in hand. Now, given the huge fiscal packages delivered in the US and the EU, of course, people have concerns about the UK entering into a subsidy war that we can't win. Liz Truss showed us where recklessness with the public finances lead. But as George Dibb at the Institute for Public Policy Research has set out, there's a powerful role for government beyond upfront subsidy. There's a role for it in reform, in regulation, in institutions, in making and shaping markets, like it did during the coronavirus pandemic in creating a guaranteed market for the vaccine. One of the lessons from the American experience is that there are lots of things you could and should do before spending huge sums of money. For Labour, reform to the planning system is example number one of that advice. I think it's widely accepted that an industrial strategy is not picking winners and leaving it at that. George Dibb suggests breaking it down in terms of production, purchasing, how governments govern, and wider economic conditions. However you cut it, supply chains, geography, finance, energy, critical minerals, security, research, regulation, they all have a role to play. So the number one mission for a Keir Starmer government will be to boost economic growth. If Rachel Reeves' iron grip on the public finances will be the bedrock of that new economy, the industrial strategy will be the fertile soil in which Britain's economy will grow. That industrial strategy will work to build the stability, investment and reform that Rachel will be talking about tonight. Taken with our major reforms to planning, our National Wealth Fund, £7.3 billion, co-investing with the private sector on hydrogen, gigafactories, renewable ports, clean steel and carbon storage. Great British Energy. Our reform of the apprenticeship levy, setting up Skills England, our new technical excellence colleges. Our New Deal for working people to boost productivity. Our commitment to devolving power and control. And our plans to strengthen Britain's hands on the world stage. This is a 10-year programme of renewal. It's about setting a business-friendly, long-term vision for the country within which the state can de-risk and crowd in private sector investment. It's about being pro-worker and pro-business because each of their successes are not mutually exclusive. It's about the knowledge that without that strategy, opportunities will be missed. Sectors we can lead in are not given the backing they deserve. The potential in every region of the country is left to wither, and business lacks the support it needs to win new orders in new markets. So what does all that mean in terms of the practice and the detail? Well, maybe taking a case study can help. Let's look at steel. Our country has been producing less and less steel. Why does that matter? Well, steel is crucial to everything we make, solar power, electric vehicles, buildings, wind turbines, across the board. It creates good, well-paid jobs across the country, and it keeps our country resilient in a world where we want to depend less for critical products on other countries. But instead of recognising the vital national importance and potential of steel and developing a strategic plan to support the UK industry, the government is making last-minute, sticking-plaster decisions on steel on a site-by-site basis. The cost has been market failure. The cost has been £500 million of taxpayers' money committed to Tata in Port Talbot, with no strings attached, thousands of jobs to be lost in return for a new, cleaner arc furnace at some point in the future. Imagine if we had an industrial strategy where we took the Harrington report seriously. What if we actually mapped steel capability in the UK and identified options and business models for securing private investment? What if we had a hydrogen strategy that could support the development of clean steel? And what if we know that we need scrap metal for steel production with electric arc furnaces? What if we work out how not to export all our scrap as we currently do? What if we had a proper carbon capture strategy so that people who make, for example, lime, which we need for steel, will invest here and not go elsewhere? Labour has earmarked up to £3 million for investment in green steel alongside industry, working with steel communities to ensure the transition comes with jobs. We also believe that defence procurement can strengthen UK sovereignty, and we see our steel sector alongside shipyards, aerospace and materials industries as national assets. Labour will make it fundamental to direct British defence investment first to British business, with a higher bar set for any decisions to buy abroad. Economic growth up, security up, jobs up. If we are lucky enough to be elected, we must show people how we can start to make their lives better from day one. I was a senior civil servant on the Olympics, and I think we did that job really successfully, where government departments worked really collaboratively to ensure a common goal. But the green transition must be a story of good jobs, of growth, of opportunity, because it won't work unless we take people with us. We need the worker in Derby to believe that under Labour, Rolls-Royce will continue to thrive. We need a student in Croydon to believe we can help them access some of the great jobs that comes with industrial renewal. We need the family in Hull to think that under Labour there will be new industry in the area as we decarbonise, bringing great jobs. We need to mean what we say and focus on fixing their problems, not ours. Keir talks about us being the party of service, and he absolutely means it. And the next Labour government want to bring back stability with a plan, a clear mission to get our future back. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That's excellent. Several of the things you mentioned can be defined as horizontal industrial policy, that's to say things like skills, the planning system and so on, and I very much applaud the emphasis you put on those, as it were, non-selective policies that affect all industries. But you also mentioned the sectors as well, and particularly steel, and if maybe I could just take up on that a little bit. So do you think that the government's recent decision to support the partial decarbonisation of Port Talbot, was that wrong, or didn't go far enough, or whatever? Because I think there is a talk about we need a strategy for steel that goes further than just having electric arc furnaces instead of coke-based furnaces. But you've got to get the private sector to invest in the areas where we are short of capacity. Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on that sector.
Yeah. So the challenge, I think, has been that the government has come in at the last minute when they see market failure and not upstream where there's potential for growth. And I think that's what's happened with Port Talbot, and we see it happen on lots of other areas as well. I mean, I was in delegated legislation yesterday where we were agreeing £75 million to BMW Mini for them to develop their electric vehicles, and wouldn't be against that, but again it's a case of the government is spending significant amounts of money in lots of different areas, but without it really sitting behind a wider strategy. So with steel, could you have a situation where you are saying, we know we will need, because of the offshore wind farms or because of the industry that we're developing, we know we will need this amount of steel. Can we create a market in the UK which is attractive enough for people to come in and produce those goods for us? Is that possible? And I think you have to start with a proper analysis, which the government hasn't done for a long time, of what is the steel capability within the country and what is the current situation. You have to do that first, and we would want to do that if we were lucky enough to get elected. You need to understand the parameters you're working with first, but can you get upstream and create some conditions where a market can begin to grow rather than continue with the managed decline that we've seen? Now, the transition to electric arc furnace is really interesting because, of course, you need fewer jobs for that transition. So what can you do with an area like South Wales and with the potential developments in the Celtic Sea to actually try and create more jobs in different sectors that people can transition to? Is that a possible path? What's the government's role in that? So the government isn't there to sort of shore up failing models, it's there to try and create the conditions for a market that can thrive.
And just one further thing on steel. Some of the European countries are pushing, I think, more strongly than we are on hydrogen-based direct reduction of iron and so on. Do you think that's an area which we should be pushing much more strongly?
Yes, I do, and hydrogen is connected to lots of different industries, and the need to develop our hydrogen in the UK is very clear. I was at an event last night with the aviation industry talking about hydrogen, and with the chief executive of EasyJet, where with short haul flights, hydrogen is the best option to look at, although sustainable aviation fuel also important, but hydrogen will be crucial in lots of different sectors. If you did have hydrogen DRI in the UK, the quantity of hydrogen that they would need is very significant. So I've been in lots of roundtables with industry saying at the moment the demand and supply for hydrogen is not aligned, so people aren't taking the plunge, and we need to make sure through interventions that government can do, but also setting that framework and that long-term goal that's where we want to get to, that we're encouraging investment in hydrogen. So I think that'll be key.
That's fine. And so I think people are interested obviously in how different a Labour industrial strategy might be. What was wrong with, as you look back, what was wrong with the 2017 industrial strategy, the Greg Clark, and if I could just say one specific example, they launched, one of the programs they launched was the Faraday Challenge for batteries for electric cars, and quite a lot of money was committed in various ways to promote that objective, which I don't know, one would say has been partially successful, not but and we have fallen behind the other European countries in terms of battery factories and so on, as everybody knows. What was wrong with it, and what would you do differently in an area like that where we need battery capacity? There's a bit of a reluctance on the part of foreign battery companies to come in. How would Labour approach that?
So I think the battery example is an example of something that was absolutely good and we should do more of. So I was at the Battery Industrialisation Centre last week in Coventry, there amongst the kind of automotive heart of the country, and what they do, I mean, they were funded through that process, and they take a proof of concept and scale it up, and they work for their customers in doing that, but they fill a gap that nobody else is filling, and they're doing some incredible stuff, and they're just down the road from the Warwick Manufacturing Group that also do incredible stuff, whether it's on steel or lots of other sectors, looking at things like plastics and rubber and all kinds of very high-end innovation. And I think that was very good, and I think Greg Clark should be applauded for that. What, of course, was wrong with it is it stopped, and we haven't had the continuity. This is not something you can do when you have 5 prime ministers, 7 chancellors, 11 plans for growth. The chaos that we've seen, the kind of huge gap of the Liz Truss era, where she believed that manufacturing was sort of best left to the Chinese, and let's leave it at that. And that continuity, I think, is really important, and that's why the way that Keir is approaching the 5 missions, it's a 10-year plan for renewal. We want not just to win one election, we want to be able to win 2, because these changes are not going to come overnight. And I think what every single business I have ever met says is we need stability, and we need a plan that is there for the long term, because if everything's changing, how are we going to know what we can invest in and what we can't? And the strengths of our country, when you ask people, people like our regulation, obviously our universities, our language, our expertise, our history, there's vast amounts we can draw on, but that instability really holds people back from investing, and I think that's what we need to see with an industrial strategy.
No, I completely agree with that, and again, just staying on batteries and cars, obviously the car industry in this country, unlike the German industry or the French industry, is overwhelmingly foreign owned. We depend on decisions taken elsewhere as to whether to invest, and so you've got 4 or 5 substantial companies, some of which are investing heavily, like Nissan in the northeast. What can you do you think, what can a Labour government do to make the UK a more attractive destination for investment by companies of that sort?
Well, bringing down energy costs would be the number one, and of course our plan to get to net zero for our energy by 2030 will have a very significant impact when it comes to energy costs, and that's what everybody always speaks to first when you meet with them. I mean, I went to see Vauxhall Stellantis in Luton recently, and they were asking for stability and certainty. They were asking for, you know, that they are trying to make a transition where they have, they're a very efficient plant, but they have to make changes that are quite substantial. They're going to have to invest some money. Is there support from government to help them do that? Our automotive industry work really well with our unions as well. There is a very united push to sort of try and make more efficiencies and try and be more productive and try and grow. So there's some good working in that space as well. And I think if we can have an industrial strategy, have potentially interventions where we need to try and sort out some of the issues around Brexit to make some of those rules work better for people, then that's the kind of climate where you can start having conversations about growth.
Yeah. Just on a different topic, and I'll just a couple of more points and then I'll open up the discussion. The whole issue of national security and defence, it's always been an ingredient in industrial policy, but become more pressing because of world affairs and the need to spend more on defence and so on. I just wondered how that impinges on your approach to industrial policy. Yeah. Does it mean that we should be making more things that are defence related instead of importing them from somewhere else? But it does seem to be an additional pressure, doesn't it, for an active involvement?
Well, I mean, absolutely, and of course with the re-election of Putin and at the weekend and everything that goes with that, we need to be very clear that we are going to fund defence properly. I think there are a couple of things in answer to that. First is John Healey was here a few weeks ago talking about our defence strategy, and as part of that he talked about the need for us to look at the things that we're going to need to procure. Can we make those things in the UK, because then you're growing the economy as you're defending the country. There's also other issues around security aside from defence where we need to be really careful and think about, for example, critical minerals. Where are we going to get our critical minerals from in the future? What countries can we go to, whether it's Australia or Canada, for perhaps more of those kinds of things that we need? But also, what's the connection then with our Foreign Office and the priorities that our Foreign Office assign to certain countries? Because there will be some countries where we need to build stronger relationships and partnerships, and that should be something that's joined up with the Foreign Office as well. And that's why Johnny Reynolds and David Lammy are talking about how these synergies can work to make government work better in that kind of space. Okay,
my last question from me. I think that Labour has made it clear that they will revive in some form the Industrial Strategy Council that Andy Haldane was running for a bit. But maybe a slightly different remit. I don't. Some people are suggesting it should have a broader remit relating to productivity more widely than just industrial policy. I just wonder if you could say a word about that.
Yes, we think it should have a statutory function, and I mean the starting point is that we are not going to be creating any of these jobs. They're all going to be created by the private sector. So if that's going to work, it's got to be in partnership, and we need to make sure everything we do can age well and develop well and change as it needs to, and be agile enough to respond to the changing world around us. So we need to make sure there is everything we do is grounded in support and advice from business, so that we're not making bad choices and not having unintended consequences, as you can sometimes do when you start pulling levers. So I think that will be absolutely core, and I think the way that Rachel Reeves has engaged with business over the last couple of years, the number of forums that are now looking at infrastructure projects or investment or growth or the National Wealth Fund, she has gathered around her a large network of people who are helping us develop this policy.
Yeah, fine. I think one of the first tasks for any new body that gets set up might be to review the 2017 strategy, what worked and what didn't work, what lessons can we draw from that? I think that would be quite a useful exercise. Okay, now I'm going to invite questions from the audience and also from our online people as well. So if you could mention your name and organisation, that would be helpful. Okay, yeah.
Peter Wilson-Smith from Emeritus Consultants. I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned technology. I'm not sure actually either of you have used the word, but what is the government's role here and what can it do to help develop, seed, encourage advanced technology industries in the UK?
Yes, you're right. I don't think I've used the word, but of course all of the development of industry that I've been talking about absolutely relies on technology. I mean, the steel example is a case in point, or the battery example, where we have these new technologies that are being developed from government funding in Coventry that I was talking about. So new technology, of course, will be absolutely crucial. And I think one of the planks of the industrial strategy that Johnny Reynolds published is speaking exactly to that across all the different industries in the country. I mean, we won't go anywhere without new technology. Those of us who've been in to the Tony Blair Institute and talked to Tony about these things, that's at the heart of what he's trying to say to Labour as well, that there are new opportunities with new technology that we need to grasp. But the challenge on some of the decarbonisation area in terms of the new technologies is that some of them require less jobs, so we need to try and work out, as I was saying, with the Celtic Sea and South Wales, how do we develop new industries around some of those that, because of new technology, will shrink in numbers of people, whereas others will grow. So all of these things, hydrogen, very exciting new technologies that we can develop there. So yeah, it's very important.
If I could just add to that question, I just wondered, and maybe this comes under a different, or does come under a different Shadow Minister, but are you reasonably happy with the way science policy is structured at the moment? In other words, you've got UKRI, which is a very large and powerful body, sort of principal source of government funding, and I imagine there would be quite a lot of reluctance to start tinkering with that. I just wonder whether you would be inclined to stick with what we've got on
yes.
that front.
Well, Peter Carl obviously is the lead in this area. I mean, I think an important principle to state at the start is that we're not in the business of breaking down things that are working perfectly well. Like, why would we be? And I think a lot of what we're trying to do in terms of pace of change, particularly around getting to net zero, if we start undoing everything and then building it back up again, then we'll delay ourselves. I think with R&D, our commitments in terms of 10-year funding are really important, and our commitments in terms of skills is really important as well. I've met so many different industries that are struggling to recruit what they need now. We know we can map out what we're going to need in the future and work back from there, which is why we want to set up Skills England, have our local technical excellence colleges, and reform the apprenticeship levy so that we can make sure, with all these new technologies and all the new developments that we'll need, we actually have the people. Welders are now on the migration list of people that we can bring into the country, because we don't even have enough welders, and so there is a huge job to be done there as well.
Okay, fine. Yes, please.
Thank you. Brett of BMF, that represents merchants, manufacturers, distributors of all the construction inputs and building materials. So the big challenges we've got is decarbonising heavy transport and from buildings, particularly heat. So my question is from what we used to call the metal bashers of the West Midlands and Yorkshire on making boilers and heat pumps is where are Labour going to go with this? Because we're in a mess at the moment. We need help in terms of understanding, are we going to tax and fine people for doing the right thing to get off of carbon? Or are we going to let foreign imports from China come in on heat pumps? Help, please. Where are Labour going?
So heat pumps is a very interesting question. Obviously, the government set themselves targets that they have failed to get anywhere near meeting, and we're going to have to deal with that when if we get into government, obviously we need to make sure there's a market, which there isn't at the moment, and it doesn't work. I mean, all kinds of transitions in terms of home energy are very difficult to navigate at the moment. We have in Croydon 2 people who are paid by the council to go around and just try and help people navigate what may or may not be available in terms of resources to help them, whether it's with insulation or heat pumps or whatever it might be. It is a nightmare to navigate because the pots of funding come in different ways and in different places at different times of the year, so you can never guarantee. So we need to make the consumer end work, and we can't be forcing people to do things that they can't afford to do. So we have to create a market, and those are, you know, some of the things that my colleague Alan Whitehead is working on at the moment. I know most of you in the room will probably know Alan as the expert on all things energy, who's sadly standing down at the next Parliament, but is working on all these things, and we do have to find solutions because, you know, huge amounts of our energy is used in the home, and we need to grapple with that.
Okay, let me take a question from our online audience. Catherine Mountain, if the system works. Okay, let's try the next one from the online. If we can. If not.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, in the second row there. Yes. Just.
No, thank you. Andrew Large from the Confederation of Paper Industries. I very much welcome your comments on not deindustrialising and decarbonising. You know, I think that, you know, that's absolutely a key thing, that the UK should use the decarbonisation agenda to drive industrial growth at the same time. And certainly, as an industry, I come from the Confederation of Paper Industries, which are the UK manufacturers of pulp and paper, and you know, we very much look forward to working with you know, an incoming government to develop, you know, what the appropriate industrial strategy would be for the UK's paper-based industries. My question really is, at the moment we see a lot of push factors out of fossil fuels, and we're very concerned that while those push factors are quite understandable, they're occurring before the net zero compatible alternative is available. And you get this valley of despair,
Yeah.
where there simply aren't profitable alternatives, competitive alternatives, and that's one of the things that drives the risk of deindustrialisation in the UK. And really, Sarah, I'd be really interested in your comments and reflections on how a new Labour government could deal with that valley of despair to ensure that UK manufacturers have viable alternatives that are zero carbon energy sources, you know, before the disincentive to push out of gas is really put into
Yes.
full effect.
Yes. Well, I mean, these are huge challenges that you talk about, and I mean, that's what an industrial strategy will look to try and cover. So I was in the Humber the other day talking to industry there, and their frustration at the delays to the first round of carbon capture and storage, and decisions that had been made to take investment out of the region because the timings just didn't work in terms of their needs. So that is a case in point, whether it's hydrogen or carbon capture or whatever the solution is. We need to find a way to work at pace in a way that's affordable for business to be able to invest. And I mean, paper, are you part of CBAM or not? Are you on the CBAM list? You're not, aren't you? I was going to say. So there are issues there about how we regulate and how we set up all of those kind of structures as well, where we need to we also need to kind of understand what the challenges are, and these are the kinds of things that we're grappling with and that need to be part of a solution in an industrial strategy. What worries me about a change of government, just an inevitable change of government, is that you have a there's a natural slowdown potentially, where the civil service sort of slow down as you head towards an election, and then a new government comes in and says, oh, well, can we think about things and set new things up, and how can we actually, if that happens, then time might run out for industries such as yourselves. So we need to work at pace as well, which is the challenge that we have before us. But yeah, very aware of the issues that you talk about.
Okay, I'm just going to ask one online questioner to come in, and then I'll go to, yeah. So this is David Mortimer from the Chartered Governance Institute. If we can get him on the...
Hello, hi. If you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. One of the questions we have, and one of the debates that seems to be quite live at the moment, is whether the level of regulation in the UK is actually in some ways off-putting to investment and off-putting to new investment, particularly from overseas. However, we have a long-standing tradition of how we manage our governance and regulation in the UK. What do you see a Labour government doing in this space and in this debate, and how can that problem be navigated?
Well, yes, that's a big challenge. I mean, I've talked to several regulators, and obviously we need to make sure that regulation is an enabler of investment and growth, and not and doesn't have the opposite effect. And I know that the Shadow Treasury team are looking in detail across the board. And I think one of the issues with regulation, one of the challenges we have, is that different regulators in different government departments can sometimes do competing things. So something might work for an industry with one regulator, and then another regulator will do something that hinders. So we need to make sure we're looking across government departments, which is something the Shadow Treasury team are doing. I mean, we've always had regulation, we'll always have it. I was with the aviation industry yesterday, and the CAA were there, and they were talking about their role. We just have to make sure that regulation works alongside whatever the models are, whether they're contract for difference or whatever the model is that we're using to bring in investment, and that it works. And you know, there are specific examples where I think we need to see change, but yeah, it's a very live question. Regulators have huge power and huge knowledge, and there's also another point about trying to bring together some of the knowledge that regulators have in sectors that are very complex, and making sure the centre and government is using that wealth of knowledge as well. And you know, obviously there are changes that government can make, like saying that a regulator has to take account of net zero and the need for us to reach net zero, and that should sit alongside the need, you know, the other things that they're looking at, which can help. But this is a big challenge, and one that I think the Shadow Treasury team are trying to get to grips with, as well as separate teams.
Okay, I'd like to take a question from the back of the... Yes. There. And then I'll come to you two in the front.
Fred Bromley from Nissan. Today's a very good day for this conversation, because the CEO of Renault and chair of the European automotive body ACEA has just published a manifesto calling for an industrial strategy for Europe. He points out that America's very good at throwing money at the problem, China's very good at strategic planning, and Europe's very good at introducing regulations. Now, there's nothing wrong with the 2035 ban, but it's crucial that we have the facilitating conditions in place to reach that point. And one of the things he's proposing is more cooperation between national governments to put those facilitating conditions in place. Is this something that you see an opportunity in for the UK? Because whilst we might not be in the EU anymore, we're certainly part of a European automotive market, with the majority of our output going to Europe.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we need to make Brexit work, and at the moment there are lots of different sectors where it doesn't. I do business breakfasts every Wednesday morning, and out of every single one there will be something that I send to Nick Thomas-Simmons, who is looking at our Brexit policy, because whatever it is, whether it's regulation or trading conditions, or the rules that people have to follow in terms of the products that they're producing, there are clearly bumps along the way that we need to try and rectify. And of course the automotive sector is a case in point. So yes, I'd be interested to read the document that you talk about. Maybe you could send it to me, and I'll have a look.
Do you think we should put tariffs on Chinese cars?
Well, I'm not going to. I think we can make our own conditions more competitive, and I think we can do more from within this country to make our country a more competitive place to invest before we do anything like
fine.
that.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. It's Hassan Turunç Koç Holding. We have a joint venture in Ford, and we produce engines here, assembled in Germany, and then finalized in Turkey, and come back here and export to the world. So it's more into steel and automotive. We're the biggest investor and joint venture here. It's my question similar to Nissan. When the timing is really amazing, because, as you know, the Inflation Reduction Act in America, made in China, all these European Green Deal, so I think it's needed, industrial strategy. But when we studied, I found funding, energy cost reduction, public-private partnership, export-oriented supply chain structures. So these are the pillar of all the industrial strategies. I think labor will have a bit of what is missing, I noticed from your speeches and studies I've been studying all your, it's funding, energy cost could be with the new geopolitics reality, AI, and maybe Trump. I know it's so many questions, but how do you think you're going to be able to implement an industrial strategy within this environment? Sorry, too many questions. Thank you.
Did you say energy costs, AI, and Trump?
Yeah.
So energy costs, I mean, our transition to net zero for energy by 2030 will hopefully transform energy costs and bring those costs down. We're looking at other interventions. Obviously, the kind of energy pricing market is enormously complex, with layers upon layers of tariffs and levies and complexity. I did another bit of delegated legislation with Nusgani last week on the supercharger, which is costing billions in terms of intervention. So anyway, I think bringing those costs down by renewable energy will be the absolute key starting point. AI obviously will be very important in all of the industries of the future, and we need to make sure it's regulated so it kind of works for everybody and doesn't have unintended consequences. And the issue of Trump, we're just going to have to see who wins the election and what he does. Some of the things he's saying, obviously people will be concerned about, but he didn't do those things when he was last in. We're just going to have to wait and see what he says. And I think there's lessons from America in terms of what Biden has done. I mean, the growth in the US economy, greater growth than any other similar nation in the last year, lower inflation falling at a greater rate, job creation very high, stock market very good. The public don't necessarily see that. They don't perceive economic improvement as the result of Biden. Home ownership is down. There are huge lessons to learn from that intervention that I think we're looking at very closely.
Okay. Yes, please.
There's a woman there, and there's the gentleman.
Sorry?
Is there that woman there?
Yeah.
As well.
Thank you. Thanks. So, Matthew Trimming from Public. We're an innovation and public policy evaluation partner to government. I also advise the Levelling Up Department on planning, which is the start of my question, really. I think, reviewing the 2017 industrial strategy, I'm sure you guys are doing that already. It's a good sort of place to start. Looking at why the current government with an 80-seat majority couldn't get planning reform through Parliament is probably another thing I'm sure you're thinking deeply about. But the one thing that you're introducing that doesn't exist in the mix at the moment is the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and it strikes me that coupled with your industrial strategy and the learnings that I've just alluded to and your planning reforms have, that's a really sort of golden triangle for you there. And I just wondered whether you wanted to say a little bit about the interaction of those three in your policy thinking.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And I mean, of course, we can look to Greg Clark and 2017. We can also look to what the last Labour government did in terms of some of the industrial policy that we introduced there. So a lot of the growth in automotive, life sciences, a lot of the renewables we see now were kind of from a strategy that existed under the last Labour government. So you can look to that too. I think planning and the National Wealth Fund are two sides of the of the same coin. We have to have the planning reforms. We have to. I mean, the grid, which we haven't talked about yet today, is something that comes up everywhere you go, and the challenges with that are not insignificant in terms of taking the public with us, and there is a big job to do in terms of making the case that this is infrastructure we need for the future. These are changes that we need for the future. They will lead to more prosperity, more money in your pocket, lower energy bills, and if we need to put infrastructure in your area, there should be some kind of payback to you, whether that's lower bills or whether that's a community fund where the community can decide what they want to pay for. So that's a huge challenge, but massively important. And I think the lesson from America in terms of you need to do some of these reforms before you start spending money is a case in point with planning. We need to get that done first. And also it is something you can do at pace in a new government if there is one. Alongside that, the National Wealth Fund is £7.3 billion of funding, and Rachel Reeves has asked a selection of people from business and industry and the former governor of the Bank of England to look at how we finance and what we finance. We've said we want to look at renewable ports. So there are, in the kind of clusters around the country, there are some sort of obvious places where you would want to be investing in renewable ports. Green steel, that's our £3 billion fund for steel, hydrogen, carbon capture, gigafactories, and the idea, what Rachel's aspiration is that for every pound the state invests, you get £3 from the private sector. So, what she's asked Mark Carney and others to look at is how is that an attractive proposition? How do you make that work? And I think you can't do that without the planning, because everybody is going to need planning reform and the grid in order to be able to do those investments, so that they go very much alongside each other.
Okay, the lady in the third, yes, please.
Thank you. Jo Milligan from Liberty Steel. Very pleased, obviously, to hear reiteration again of the commitment to green steel, and obviously in recent times an acceleration of spending that money. In respect of the sort of ubiquity and utility of steel, very pleased there's recognition of that, especially in terms of the energy transition and what I would call the new net zero economy and the opportunities that exist there. I think my question would be, downstream from steel making are a number of assets in this country that make critical products, especially for the energy transition. How much more can we expect in the manifesto around how Labour's commitment on steel is actually going to be applied?
That's a very good question, Joanne. So I suspect with some of the detail that the manifesto will be a slightly lighter document, but I'm sure steel will be within the mix in terms of what we set out. I think the challenge for Labour is, if there is a change of government, what can we do in terms of conversations with the civil service around some of the detail of what we might want to do. We haven't published that yet. We are looking at that and talking to people such as yourself about what that could look like. And I do think what I talked of in one of the answers to the questions about needing to be able to also map out what is the capability, what is the possibility. We need to do that piece of work as well, which you do best in government. But equally, we've talked about spending that money at pace, and you need to work at pace to be able to do what we've set out to achieve. But I mean that means working with all of the existing companies that exist within the UK already, and thinking is there more that could be brought in as well.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, if there is, or maybe two more questions then from just that part of the audience.
Will Prescott from Bright Blue. You've mentioned sort of the dreaded B word a couple of times with Brexit, and part of the strategy is trying to negotiate sort of better sector-by-sector arrangements. Obviously, no one wants to revisit the whole the wider settlement. I think this country's got enough PTSD from that. But how much do you realistically think you can sort of wiggle concessions out of the Europeans, because they very much are sort of the very anti-pro cake and pro eating it at the same time, to coin a phrase. So are you aiming for sort of sector by sector deals, and do you think you can get them?
So we'll have to see. I mean, there has been an improvement in relationships and ways of working. I'll give that to Rishi Sunak in terms of the, not saying that the French are necessarily whatever it was Liz Truss said they were. I can't even remember. But we have had closer relationships, and I think we want to build on that and make sure we're getting the best we can. And there are loads of examples where I know that Nick Thomas-Simmons is looking at what some of these struggles are. So I mean, I talked to white goods industry where they were saying, if you're looking to import into the EU, are you actually going to import into the UK at the moment, because you've got a whole different set of standards and models to follow? What do we do about that? Do we just accept that there'll be less fridges imported into the UK than into the EU, or do we try and align a bit more in terms of what the rules are? And that's what Nick is looking at. Clearly, every sector has an issue with trying to make transition of goods and services as smooth as we possibly can, whilst not for 1 minute reopening the debate on Brexit.
Okay, last question then, and I think in the same row as the previous one.
Hi, Shamir Hale from the Royal Horticultural Society. We've heard a lot about sort of new technologies and carbon storage, but gardening, as well as being the sort of nation's pastime, has a huge role to play in terms of developing green skills, carbon sequestration, carbon storage, pollution capture, and wondered what your view was on the role of nature-based industries and land-based industries going forward.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important question, and we need to have a kind of nature strategy that works. All of the products that we produce we're getting to the point where we're thinking about them in a kind of circular way, and how do we renew all of the different things we're making, and the role of nature and the role of some of the interventions that we want to see in terms of industry. So whether it's how we produce enough food in the UK versus solar energy, for example, is a kind of debate in some local communities, and these are conversations we have to have. Our marine as well, so talking to the Crown Estate about how we have a marine strategy that sits alongside our strategy for offshore wind farms. I mean, all these things are really important, and definitely something that we're looking at, and something where government departments need to come together. So whether it's DEFRA in this case and Department of Energy, Department of Business, how do they link up a bit more effectively so that these things sit together and work together?
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our allotted span, so I would like to express my thanks to Sarah for her remarks and for her answering the questions so fully and helpfully, and thank you all for your questions. Thank you.